So I've covered the fantasy genre a lot on my channel over the last 2 years or something. And I even covered it recently with Jon Stewart saying that the goblins in Harry Potter were like anti-Semitic caricatures of racist stuff like the Nazis used to believe and stuff like that. But today I want to take a bit of a deeper dive into fantasy, and in particular racism within fantasy, mainly about how fantasy authors often take what they know personally and translate it to their fantasy work. And that includes bringing over the concept of race. Race is a societal construct. Race doesn't really exist. I mean, we have to treat it like it exists now, but the invention of race was created over hundreds of years. People seem to always get funny when I talk about racism being a hierarchy of invented races, but the racialization of Anglo-Saxons as a race is something, because Anglo-Saxons in their view exist at the top of the racial pyramid. In their view, below them you have the Spanish and the Italians, who may be Christian but also might have Muslim and Jewish blood in them, so they're not as pure as you guys. And as you see with when settlers went to new worlds, particularly Spanish and Portuguese settlers, they created whole systems of racial hierarchies based on how Spanish or Portuguese you were. So when we're talking about someone like Tolkien, for example, who of course wrote all these books set in Middle-earth, he isn't immune to the prejudices of his day when creating his races in his Middle-earth books. And then you take things like Goblins from Harry Potter, which are obviously created with J.K. Rowling either being ignorant or knowing about goblins often being used as a stand-in for Jewish people in a lot of fantasy stuff, which even the Nazis believed, and we're going to get onto that at the end. I mean, you have more modern incarnations like the Twilight films and the Twilight books, which have racist problems because they're based on the author's own views on things like the Quileute tribe, who she never met or asked permission to use them in her works, but she depicts them as a group of wolves who have uncontrollable rage and often bloodlust, compared to the mainly white vampires, the Cullens, who can actually control their bloodlust. And you guys might think, well, it's fantasy, it's not real, but with many fantasy works, often depictions of certain groups of people are based on bigoted views of the real world. So we're going to get into all of that today. But before we get any further, if you guys want to support my channel, please like the video, maybe comment and subscribe if you're new. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to support my work going forward, no matter what YouTube does with its weird demonetization, we're actually in a new phase where YouTube have decided that they don't trust me again. All of a sudden, you guys will remember in December I was talking about this as well. Well, they're doing it again. So if you want to support my work continuing for the future, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build up with as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of that are getting access to the private patrons Discord server and my Nintendo Switch friend code. Also, I live stream normally on a Tuesday and Thursday, and those streams are archived on my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra. So I think I should start this video off by saying you are not a bad person for liking fiction which has problematic aspects in it. I like the cyberpunk genre. I love the original Blade Runner film. I've made videos talking about how these films in this genre has problems with racism. In Cyberpunk's case, it's mainly the Orientalism in regards to the depiction of Asian culture in this genre. And even something like Dune, for example. Everyone likes Dune now, it's very, very popular, and even the movie has some problematic aspects with its depiction of essentially space Muslims. Because if you know the fiction of Dune, you know that Dune is based on Muslim countries' anti-colonial revolutions, but then you have things like Paul Atreides being called the Mahdi. That's obviously drawing from things like, the war in Sudan against the British and stuff, and just general Islam. But then even the film doesn't get the nuance right, in my opinion. I've made a whole video on this. And then, of course, we go to the fantasy genre. So to start with, here is how goblins are described in the Harry Potter books. So goblins are a highly intelligent race of small magical humanoid beings with long fingers and feet that coexist within the wizarding world. Their diets consist of meat, roots, and fungi. Goblins converse in a language called gobbledygook and are adept metalsmiths, notable for their silverwork. They even mint coins for wizarding currency. Due to their skills of money and finances, they control the wizarding economy to a large extent and run Gringotts Wizarding Bank. So you guys can see why that's problematic, having a whole race in a fantasy world essentially tied to banking Now, what do the far right often believe that one race of people are tied to? Well, it's the global monetary system. This is what Nazis often believe about Jewish people. And if you write a whole race of creatures like that, you obviously, if I'm being charitable, have a massive blind spot with anti-Semitism, ironic considering J.K. Rowling loves to call all anti-Zionists anti-Semites while writing goblins in her book like this. Not to mention the awful depiction of goblins in the Harry Potter films, which, like I said in my video about this stuff, I'm sure if she thought it was such a problem, she could have got them to change it, because you wouldn't want Warner Brothers to get in a big scandal of a fantasy race of creatures. Now, I also mentioned Twilight as well. Like, go watch my video on Twilight for everything about that. But how Twilight is different is it's a more like modern incarnation of vampires versus werewolves. But the problem, like I was saying in that video, is Stephanie Meyer's, the author of the books, went to where the Quileute tribe's territory is, took like their sacred pebbles from their beach without their permission. Lots of her fans went and did that, and basically her depiction of Native Americans in her work is, in my mind, based on like over a century of their depiction in Hollywood films, where they're always like the stand-in for the villains, they're savages, they were never treated well. And this really racist depiction of them in very popular Western movies helped spread this image of them often being savages. I think the lack of a popular like native film centered around natives is pretty telling of this. Like, even films like The Revenant and Last of the Mohicans are about a white man going native. It's not really about actual natives. It's about like a white man pulled between the civilized world and like the savage world. Now let's move on to Lord of the Rings. Now we're going to talk mostly about Lord of the Rings in this video. We've got a really fun bit and a really bizarre bit about Camp Hobbit, which was a fascist Italian camp in the 70s based on Lord of the Rings. But I want to talk about the films and the reaction to the films first. Now, like I said earlier, I don't think like Tolkien or Peter Jackson are massive racists or anything like that, but it shows that the original work was a product of its time. It's written by a guy who was born in the 19th century, a guy who was born and lived in the British Empire at its height. He was born in South Africa, and by the standards of the time, he wasn't like the most racist dude ever. But I've told you in multiple videos, if you're a white person who grows up in a Western country, even today, you are pretty much going to be indoctrinated with racism. I've spoke how when I was about like 19, how I viewed Muslims, like not in like a really bigoted way, but I can see how my views in that religion were really tinged by the general Islamophobia in British society. If you were growing up in like colonial South Africa and Britain and stuff like that, guaranteed you're gonna have some pretty weird views on race and racism by today's standards. Even when the films came out like over 2 decades ago now, people were talking about Lord of the Rings being racist, and it was widely like dismissed, like stupid SJWs getting triggered by a fantasy thing. How can Lord of the Rings be racist? So I want to read you some initial reactions to the films. So I want to read you some quick initial reactions to the films. So the Scotsman reporting Lord of the Rings labelled racist. Dr. Stephen accused the author JRR Tolkien of using the novels to make racial prejudice innocent by presenting bigotry for a fantasy world. The academic claimed, put simply, Tolkien's good guys are white and the bad guys are black, slant-eyed, unattractive, inarticulate, and psychologically underdeveloped horde. His comments were attacked by HarperCollins, publishers of the trilogy, and the Tolkien Society, who insisted the writer was not a racist. Dr. Shapiro said that in the trilogy, a small group, the Fellowship, is pitted against the onset of a foreign horde. This reflected long-standing Anglo-European anxieties about being overwhelmed by non-European populations. While Tolkien describes the hobbits and elves as amazingly white, ethnically pure clans, their antagonists, the orcs, are a motley, dark-skinned mass akin to tribal Africans or Aborigines. He said Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings because he wanted to recreate a mythology for the English that had been destroyed by foreign invasion. He felt organic English culture had been destroyed by the Normans. There's a notion that foreigners destroy culture, and there was also a fantasy that there was a solid, homogenous English culture there to begin with, which was not the case because there were Celts and Vikings and a host of other groups. So in response to this, Barry Clark, a spokesman for HarperCollins, said that Dr. Shapiro was basically wrong. A number of people have said that they think The Lord of the Rings could be an allegory for the Second World War or the First, as Tolkien fought in it, but it was never a view that he agreed with. His great abiding passion and interest came from the Icelandic sagas and mythology, and this was his version of one of these sagas. Richard Crawshaw, A trustee for the Tolkien Society said there was definitely no racial intent in his work. He detested racism. So I'm not saying I definitely agree with what Shapiro was saying. I think there is a bit of like a death of the author thing going on with Lord of the Rings generally, but we haven't discussed much, I think, in society widely how racism really characterizes a lot of people's fictional works. Now, I don't doubt that Tolkien, as like a professor of Anglo-Saxon history, was inspired by the Icelandic sagas, which were these written works about like the Viking conquest and the history of the time. And I don't think he was set out to write like these books with racist intent. That doesn't mean there can't be racism inherent in the work when the author is a product of his time. So one more article I want to read from The Guardian, which is a bit more like self-aware and thinking like, am I looking too deep into this? So John Yatt writing, Wraiths and Race. When I got home, I dug out my copy of The Lord of the Rings from a box somewhere. Okay, so I pulled it straight off the shelf and found there was worse to come. The Two Towers is a story of the battle between Isengard and Rohan. In the good corner, the riders of Rohan, aka the Whiteskins, yellow is their hair and bright are their spears. Their leader is very tall. In the evil corner, the Orcs of Isengard, a grim, dark band, swart, slant-eyed, and the dark, wild men of the hills. So the good guys are white and the bad guys are black. The genetic determinism drives the plot in the most brutal manner. White men are good, dark men are bad, orcs are the worst of all. While 10,000 orcs are massacred with the kind of Dungeons and Dragons version of biological warfare, the wild men left standing at the end of this battle are packed off back to their homes with nothing more than slapped wrists. We also get a sneak preview of the army that's going to be representing the forces of darkness in part 3. Guess what? Dark faces, black eyes, and long black hair and gold rings in their ears. Very cruel, wicked men they look. They come from the east and the south. They wield scimitars and ride elephants. Scratch the surface of Tolkien's world and you'll find a curiously 20th century myth. Begun in the 1930s, published in the 50s, it's shot through with the preoccupations and prejudices of its time. There is no clash of noble adversaries like the Iliad, no story of our common humanity like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a fake, a forgery, a dodgy copy. Strip away the archaic turns of phrase and you find a set of basic assumptions that are frankly unacceptable in 21st century Britain. So I prefer that take a bit more in that it's really talking about how Lord of the Rings is a product of a white man who grew up in the British Empire, writing about things he knows, but when he talks about race, it buys into a lot of the racism of the time. Like, you have whole races of people that are essentially bred to be warriors. That's how the British often viewed like the Turks. They often viewed like the Maori like this. They viewed various tribal peoples essentially just bred to fight. And then if any of you guys have read Edward Said's Orientalism, I feel like a poli-sci basic bitch always bringing this book up, but he talks about in like one of the first chapters this guy called Lord Cromer, who was a high-ranking official in Egypt, wrote a lot of books about Egypt, brought them back to the UK at the start of the 20th century, and his book was full of racism. It said that the Egyptians were all lazy and couldn't be bothered to do anything, but they'd try and like swindle you or steal from you if they could. And that was British people's knowledge of other countries. Really, really racist stereotypes about whole groups of people. Now, of course, Tolkien was an academic. He was an intellectual. He could have known better. But at the same time, it's very hard to believe he was completely immune to this racism, especially when you read his own work, which buys into a lot of these tropes about races basically having a predetermined like destiny or characteristics based on their race. And as we all know, race is made up. It's a label people give to other groups of people. Ethnicity, yes, but it kind of plays into that as well. Like with Harry Potter, well, goblins control the money. With the Uruk, they're just bred to be warriors like the Maori or like the Huns back in the day or something like that. And like I was saying earlier, Tolkien was not like the worst racist of his time. I want to actually get into some of the good things he did for a guy of his time, like his view on the Nazis, his view on South African apartheid. But then I want to get a bit more into the problems of race in Lord of the Rings before we get on to Camp Hobbit in Italy for the last segment of the video. So starting with the Nazis, what's classier than Tolkien telling off the Nazis? Absolutely nothing. In 1938, Tolkien was in talks with Berlin publishing house Rutten and Loning to release a German language edition of The Hobbit. Things were going smoothly until the publisher suddenly required documentation of Tolkien's Aryan heritage. This rankled Tolkien such that he wrote to his friend and publisher Stanley Unwin, I must say that enclosed letter from Rutten and Loning is a bit stiff. Do I suffer this impertinence because of a possession of a German name, or do their lunatic laws require a certificate of Irish origin from all persons of all countries? Personally, I should be inclined to refuse to give any Bestattigung, although it happens that I can, and let a German translation go hang. In any case, I should object strongly to such a declaration appearing in print. I do not regard the probable absence of all Jewish blood as necessarily honourable, and I have many Jewish friends, and I should regret giving any colour to the notion that I subscribe to a wholly pernicious and unscientific race doctrine. You are primarily concerned, and I cannot jeopardize the chance of a German publication without your approval, so I submit 2 drafts of possible answers. So it's pretty clear, like, he rejects the Nazi-specific brand of race science. So Tolkien drafted 2 letters for the publisher, one that ignored the request, and a kiss-off that discreetly called them idiots of buying into the Third Reich's historically bankrupt appropriation of the term Aryan. It's unclear which version Unwin sent, but the interesting one was dated July 25th, 1938. Thank you for your letter. I regret that I am not as clear as to what you intend by Aryan. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is Indo-Iranian as far as I'm aware. None of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects, but if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. My great-great-grandfather came to England in the 18th century from Germany. The main part of my descent is therefore purely English, and I am an English subject, which should be sufficient. I have been accustomed nonetheless to regard my German name with pride, and continue to do so throughout the period of the late regrettable war in which I served in the English army. I cannot, however, forbear to comment that if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule of the matter of literature, then the time is not far distant when a German name will no longer be a source of pride. Your inquiry is doubtless made in order to comply with the laws of your own country, but that this should be held to apply to other subjects of another state would be improper, even if it had, as it has not any bearing whatsoever on the merits of my work or its sustainability for publications. So like I was saying, it's clear Tolkien does not agree with the Nazis. He generally isn't racist towards Jewish people, counts them among his friends. It's meant to be like, I guess, a more positive outlook on them, when a lot of people in the entire world absolutely hated Jewish people, including England and the United States. It wasn't just Germany who didn't like Jewish people. Of course, Anne Frank's whole family were actually turned away from the US when they fled Holland in the first place. So now let's talk about his views on apartheid quick. So Tolkien, born in the Orange Free State, knew of the prejudices which were found in his birthplace, prejudices which he firmly opposed. In his valedictory address to the University of Oxford, he mentioned his firm detestation of all forms of apartheid. But I do not claim to be the most learned of those who have come hither from far end of the dark continent, but I have the hatred of apartheid in my bones, and most of all, I detest the segregation or separation of language and literature. I do not care which of them you think white. I wouldn't say it's like the strongest condemnation of the deeply racist African system, like calling it the dark continent and stuff, but again, I think this also proves he was as good as you could expect one to be, while also having like the language and worldview of his time. Like, no one today is calling Africa the dark continent, for example. So it's pretty easy to say that Tolkien is literally like the most influential fantasy writer in history. His work has influenced so much that has come afterwards and pretty much made the fantasy genre like insanely popular. Like, fantasy has always been popular. Fables and everything like that have always been in our history. A load of these creatures have been around for ages and ages, but it's safe to say like Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and the influence of those books really made it absolutely massive. And of course, we live in the world today with like Game of Thrones, The Witcher, loads of fantasy coming out and being developed for TV, which was all pretty much influenced by Tolkien. But just like with cyberpunk, inherently because of its creation having a problem of Orientalism and often anti-Asian racism, Tolkien fantasy does have the inherent problem of racism and giving certain races certain characteristics which they're just essentially born with. And a lot of people in the Dungeons and Dragons community have spoke about that, so we're just going to talk about this quick and bounce off that to talk more about Lord of the Rings and races. Article by Jeremy Blum, Dungeons and Dragons, race issues have deep roots in the world of fantasy. Critics have pointed out that when creating a character, D&D players must choose a race, such as an elf, dwarf, or gnome, and that this usage of the word is technically a misnomer. Races in D&D are fundamentally different than our concept of medievalist Paul B. Lutervant told the Huffington Post, in D&D, races are based in deep biological differences, whereas we know that in the real world, race is a social construct based on arbitrary and superficial differences. using the word race in a game where they really mean something more like species promotes racist ideas. In his novel, Tolkien outlined the racial characteristics of men, of dwarves, of elves and orcs. Sturtevant wrote, adding that Tolkien created the blueprint for the troubling relationship between race and fantasy that would govern 20th century fantasies. A look at D&D's Player's Handbook, an online resource database, offers a glimpse at how modern fantasy has internalized Tolkien's ideas about race. Elves, for instance, are described as good, often depicted as white, except for a subspecies known as drow, who are ebony-skinned, more often evil than not, and occasionally called dark elves. Half-orcs are similarly described as having a tendency towards chaos, and the most accomplished half-orcs are those with enough self-control to get by in a civilized land. James Mendez Hodds, a game designer and cultural consultant, wrote a comprehensive analysis of such language on the website and pointed out that Tolkien, widely acknowledged as the creator of orcs, had initially described orcs in letters as degraded and repulsive versions of the least lovely Mongol types. So we're going to get onto that article, but just having a look at what D&D says about role-playing as an orc. Most orcs have been indoctrinated into a life of destruction and slaughter, but unlike creatures who by their very nature are evil, such as gnolls, it's possible that an orc raised outside its culture could develop a limited capacity for empathy, love and compassion. No matter how domesticated an orc might seem, its bloodlust flows just beneath the surface. With its instinctive love of battle and its desire to prove its strength, an orc trying to live within the confines of civilization is faced with a difficult task. And there you can see with that description, like very, very clear racial stereotypes about like Native Americans, Aborigines, Maori peoples, all these native groups who are often compared to animals. And like you have the things of like the Catholic Church trying to like civilize these people by taking them to these boarding schools and killing a lot of them. You can see how this is problematic to kind of set people's worldview up as races having inherent characteristics. So getting on to James's article, this is what Tolkien said. The orcs are definitely stated to be corruptions of the human form seen in elves and men. They are squat, broad, flat nose, sallow skin with wide mouths and slant eyes, in fact degraded and repulsive versions of the least lovely Mongol types. That is from his letter 210, and he just describes me and all my relatives on my mum's side. Why would he say that? We say Tolkien invented orcs as we know them today. More precisely, he synthesized their nature from various traditional characterizations, not of mythical beings, but of real-life humans. Some of those characterizations came from popular European conceptions of the greatest threat to Western civilization. Others came from pseudo-scientific frameworks of racism, some of which Tolkien would have encountered in his academic training. So orcs are degenerate corruptions of the OG elves, kind of like how Mongoloids and other people of colour are, in Westerners' view, corrupt, degenerate versions of noble white Caucasoids whom they resent. Now, with that description of orcs, which starts his piece, which comes from Tolkien's letter 210, makes more sense. When he writes Mongol types, he straight up tells us he made the Mongol terror and the Mongoloid stereotype into an entire species. Further visual description of orcs throughout his work match this letter, although he likes to mention how black, dark, or swart they are, all terms applied to Indians in Tolkien's time as well as Africans. We've already seen that a description of orcs' violent nature and the British Army's criteria for the martial races are identical, but even with the orcish ranks as another martial subrace, the Uruk-hai, bred for size and soldiering aptitude, the orcs' masters give us the hierarchy. Martial race theory recommends a more thoughtful commander from a higher race in charge of natural-born soldiers from the martial race. Those commanders are the Dark Lords Melkor and Sauron, and the human wizard Saruman the White. So for all the talk of Tolkien not being like a fervent racist, like I've been saying at the start of the video, someone like him, growing up in the British Empire, South Africa and England, serving in the British military, a colonial British military, where white men commanded black men, commanded Indian soldiers to do the fighting for them on the battlefields of Europe and the Middle East, you could see how that would influence someone's worldview anyway. And in the societal context, it seems far more likely Tolkien would have been influenced by the race science of the era. And that explains how he depicts the races in things like Lord of the Rings. And even if you kind of remove the fears of like contemporary Britain during the time of like immigration and the xenophobia there, as someone who loved his history, he's probably well aware of how people in the time that he covered viewed like the Huns, viewed the Seljuk Turks as like these invading, conquering hordes who couldn't be stopped. Of course, later on the Mongols as well. But then the Yellow Peril was rife still in Tolkien's time, so it's probably not surprising he used a lot of Orientalist descriptions of various races of people to form his own work. So we're moving on now to fascism. Well, the Nazis always loved to believe in fantasy stuff. A lot of Nazis, including Heinrich Himmler and most people who led the SS, believed basically in a fantasy of the world. They believed the German race of people was 200,000 years old. They used to have magical powers, but through like slow interbreeding with various other races like gnomes, dwarves, and things like that, they slowly lost their powers, but they had the lineage of the Atlanteans. They're basically descended from the people who used to live in Atlantis, while all the other races and ethnicities were basically humans who had breeded with various mythical creatures. I'm not even joking, they actually believe this stuff. So it's not surprising a lot of fascists would like fantasy in general, but this article was absolutely fascinating by Atlas Obscura, how Hobbit camps rebirthed Italian fascism. From 1977, crowds of militant youth gathered to discuss Tolkien and totalitarianism. So we're going to get into this article now, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's really, really interesting, something I'd only just discovered. Bilbo Baggins is hardly the stuff of Aryan racial fantasy. It's hard to imagine Tolkien's furry, gluttonous protagonist goose-stepping the halls of Bag End or organising mass rallies in the Shire, but for thousands of Italian fantasy fans, Hobbits are the symbol of a radical movement to reimagine fascism and restore far-right movements to glory. Not long before Tolkien first published The Hobbit in 1937, Italy was a great laboratory of experimental thought. Futurists composed music made entirely of motor noises. Marxists like Gramsci preached against cultural hegemony from jail cells. From this heady mix emerged Julius Evola, one of history's most influential philosophers of fascism. Borrowing from Eastern philosophy and Western law, Evola's magnum opus, Revolt Against the Modern World, describes the history of European civilization as one in decline. The stated cause of its decline was progress away from the mythical traditions and wisdom towards industrialization and cultural miscegenation. Edged out of the mainstream, Evola faded from fashion, but elements of his philosophy, known as traditionalism, lingered on the edges of the mainstream thought. Like Tolkien's Ring of Power, they lay dormant, waiting for their moment to rise again. When Lord of the Rings was first published in Italian in 1971, the latent politics of his stout-hearted heroes bubbled to the surface. Appearing when it did, The Lord of the Rings had an outsized influence on the Italian cultural scene. For Italy's disillusioned youth, Tolkien's book seemed to affirm the noble struggle of traditional societies against the encroaching menace of industrialization, progressive politics, and groupthink. In 1977, leaders from Italy's far-right party and youth movement planned to change that. They proposed a fascist Woodstock, a 2-day back-to-nature retreat organized around the celebration of Tolkien's work. They called it Camp Hobbit. Held in the oppressive heat of July in southern Italy, Camp Hobbit was equal parts music festival, Tolkien seminar, and anarchist commune. Stage covered with musical instruments and amplifiers, a colourful tent city, stalls selling posters, trinkets, books, and t-shirt, recorded one diarist. It was Occupy Wall Street meets Glastonbury, but the spectre of fascism was not far away. About a dozen muscular guys maintaining order, distinguished by an armband with a Celtic cross. The crowd was quite diverse, dominated naturally by fascist haircuts, military clothing, and black handkerchiefs, but also some long hair and beards. By bringing together youth from the radical right and left in an orgy of creative activity, organisers had hoped to span a new traditionalist literature, cinema, music, and art. A few bands formed, among them the Tents of Camp Hobbit. It was freedom, liberation from old patterns and mental habits, says Mario Bartoluzzi, the frontman for the Fellowship of the Ring, a traditionalist band found at Camp Hobbit. There was in all of us the desire to get out of the ghetto of exclusion. Many attendees saw themselves as transcending the binary of Italian politics by fusing leftist social critiques with the militancy of fascism. Beneath its festive spirit, Camp Hobbit had hoped to recode the language of the hippie left with the traditionalist philosophy of Evola. Camp Hobbit spawned 2 successful sequels, drawing several thousand attendees, but the coalition emerging from Camp Hobbit quickly fell into infighting. In recent years, however, the movement has seen a somewhat of a resurgence. In July, members of Italy's new right organised Campo Hobbit 40, an attempt to resurrect the spirit of the original original camp on its 40th anniversary. Evola 2 is enjoying renewed popularity, beloved by the American alt-right. As for Tolkien, the political meaning of his work is as murky as it ever was. Despite a cast of hundreds, Middle-earth remains an empty stage onto which ideologies of all stripes can project their politics. Even 6 feature films and countless imitators have failed to bring traditionalist critiques into the mainstream. So that is like pretty fascinating, like a whole fascist camp based on the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. But like you can see where fascists would read into this stuff, because with the orcs you can kind of, you know, put whatever political message you want on them. Like some people saying it could have been like the proletariat and the working class trying to really overthrow the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. So, you know, the hobbits could be like the bourgeoisie, the aristocracy could be the elves. But then with these people, it's like traditionalism. Like the hobbits are basically a nice stand-in for their fascist traditionalist views. And even you see at the end of Lord of the Rings, the third one, not in the book, not actually in the film, is that these men take over the Shire and like industrialize it, and the hobbits together fight a war to defeat them. So in this regard, it's more like a death of the author thing, where you can really put so many different messages into Lord of the Rings. You could read Lord of the Rings like through a Marxist lens. I've seen people analyze Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit through a Marxist point of view, and it is like quite compelling. A lot of it, there are some flaws and there are some bits that don't really match up, but you can even like put a Marxist message on the Fellowship, not even the orcs. But as regards to like the racism stuff, I do think there is room to criticize this stuff, and I do think like you can love this stuff and going forward change it, because look what they're doing in Star Wars now with the Tusken Raiders in The Mandalorian, and especially Boba Fett. Like the Tusken Raiders were basically stand-ins for like any native tribe of people, just depicted as like savages, savage nomads, couldn't speak, loved to like burn down villages and like shoot people and stuff. And now they're kind of trying to show nuance, show their like humanity and stuff like that in Star Wars. And that's something like I really like to see, like take something that is like bordering on a racist caricature and actually make it quite interesting. So of course you can do that with things like orcs. I told you guys on stream what I'd want for a Lord of the Rings game, and I said it would be really cool to have a Lord of the Rings game set about like 200 to 400 years after the end of the third book, and have you play as like a surviving Uruk-hai. You know, I don't know if that fits in the lore, but we had sexy Shelob, so let's say we can put it in the lore. And this Uruk-hai could be like a sort of Witcher-style person who's not treated very well by society, but then it could kind of reclaim this group and give it a lot more nuance and really show them as something beyond like the racist caricatures they are. And as a side note, I think it could have like a pretty cool commentary on like religion if these people still kind of like worship Saruman for creating them. I don't know. I like this idea because I'm really desperate for a very good open world Lord of the Rings game, and I kind of like the idea as playing as like an outcast and giving the Uruk-hai, who look visually very cool and have like really cool armor and swords, and maybe giving them some nuance like the Tusken Raiders in like Boba Fett and Mandalorian. So anyway, that is it for the video. Please let me know if I've left out anything important throughout this discussion. It's probably going to be a very, very long one, but I enjoyed talking about this stuff. If you want to support my work, check out my Patreon. If you want to follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to join a community, check out the Discord and the subreddit. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.